An Art Deco pool built for 3,000 swimmers, a ballroom where Tommy Dorsey played to 1,800 dancers a night. Glen Echo Park, Maryland, once drew tens of thousands of families every weekend, until 1968 when it shut its gates, sold off its rides, and left its own pool to roti for over a decade. The reason wasn't money, it was a carousel. Rewind to 1888. Brothers Edwin and Edward Baltsley made their fortune off something almost absurdly small, a mechanical egg beater. With that money, they bought 516 acres of riverside land above the Potomac, just outside Washington, D.C., and they didn't build a park, they built a movement. By 1891, they'd founded the National Chautauqua of Glen Echo, part summer retreat, part traveling university, the kind of place where a middle-class family could spend a week studying scripture, hearing lectures, and pretending they lived a more cultured life than they actually did. It opened June 16, 1891, with a 6,000-seat amphitheater built right on the riverbank. John Philip Sousa brought his band for the opening season. Clara Barton, fresh off founding the American Red Cross, built her own home right next door and personally ran the Chautauqua's Women's Committee. For one summer, it looked like the Baltsleys had built something untouchable. But there was a problem, and it had been there before the first tent was even pitched. The brothers had already sunk a fortune into a private streetcar line meant to carry visitors out from the city, and it barely worked. By the time the season wrapped, they were buried in debt they hadn't told anyone about. Then a member of the Chautauqua's own staff died, most likely of pneumonia. But word spread through Washington that Glen Echo's air was full of malaria, and in an era when nobody fully understood how the disease actually worked, that rumor was enough on its own. Ticket sales collapsed almost overnight. By 1892, barely a year after Sousa played its opening ceremony, the National Chautauqua of Glen Echo was finished. The land sat forgotten for almost 2 decades. Then, in 1911, somebody else saw an opportunity in the wreckage, the Washington Railway and Electric Company. What they built next wasn't really designed to be loved. It was designed to sell streetcar tickets. Glen Echo reopened as a trolley park, one of dozens built across the country for a single reason: give people somewhere to go on the weekend, and they'll pay for the ride to get there. From the moment it reopened, the park's survival was tied to something it didn't control, a transportation company's business model, not its own. For a while, that didn't seem to matter at all. The company hired a manager named Leonard Schloss, and Schloss did something smart. He dropped the entrance fee entirely. Nobody paid to walk in. The park made its money on rides, food, and games instead, which meant the more people who showed up, the better. And Schloss kept giving people reasons to show up. Almost every year brought something new. In 1921 alone, the park added a wooden roller coaster called the Coaster Dips, a hand-carved Denzel carousel, and, according to local histories, the first bumper car ride in the entire country. Within a few years, a trip to Glen Echo wasn't a special occasion anymore. It was just what a Saturday looked like. By the early 1930s, the park stopped looking like a leftover trolley stop and started looking like something out of a movie. The transit company brought in architect Edward Chopin, and Chopin gave the place the Art Deco identity people still associate with it today. In 1931 came the Crystal Pool, 1.5 million gallons of water, room for roughly 3,000 swimmers at once, with its own artificial sand beach. 2 years later came the Spanish Ballroom, with 7,500 square feet of maple dance floor, room for up to 1,800 people to dance at the same time, under a Spanish mission roofline unlike anything else on the East Coast. The entrance got the same treatment, a wide gate lit up in neon, wrapped around an arcade that kept expanding through the 1940s and 50s. And people came, not just for the rides, but for the music. Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey played the Spanish Ballroom. So did Lawrence Welk. So did Artie Shaw. In 1954, Bill Haley and his Comets played Glen Echo and brought rock and roll in with them. Attendance figures from this era vary depending on the source, but multiple accounts describe weekends in the early 1940s where more than 30,000 people came through the gates, with one wartime opening day reportedly pulling in around 15,000 visitors in a single afternoon. Those numbers are estimates. But even as estimates, they tell you this wasn't a regional curiosity. This was one of the biggest weekend destinations in the entire D.C. area. Picture it, the band organ on the carousel playing the same looping melody for the 100th time that day. The coaster dips climbing high enough that, for 2 or 3 seconds, you could see the whole Potomac River before the drop. Kids waited in line just to smell the chlorine and hear the diving boards creak. For a lot of D.C. area families, summer had a very specific sound. Water splashing against a 3,000-person pool and a big band tuning up 200 feet away. Employees worked there for decades. Kids grew up, had kids of their own, and brought them back to the same carousel. It looked unstoppable. But underneath all of it, 2 problems were sitting there, quietly, doing nothing for now. The first one was baked into the park from its very first trolley-era opening in 1911. Glen Echo was whites only. For decades, that wasn't treated as a weakness. It was just policy, the same as at plenty of other places in the region. None of this happened in a vacuum either. Washington, D.C. itself was already desegregating, its public schools integrated back in 1953. Glen Echo just happened to sit in Maryland, close enough to the city to feel its influence, but legally separate enough to keep doing things the old way a little longer than everyone around it. The second problem was one nobody was watching at all. The park still depended almost entirely on the exact business model it had been built for back in 1911: streetcars. And America was already falling out of love with them. Cars were getting cheaper. Roads were getting better. By the late 1940s, more families owned cars than ever before, and new highways were making it easier to drive somewhere else entirely for a weekend. Someplace bigger, newer, with attractions Glen Echo's aging rides couldn't match. Glen Echo, in other words, had never looked more alive, right at the exact moment both of its foundational problems became impossible to fix quietly. By the mid-1950s, the first crack was impossible to ignore anymore. Just across the trolley tracks, in the mostly Jewish, mostly liberal neighborhood of Bannockburn, residents had started picketing Glen Echo's whites-only policy, and the contradiction sitting at the center of it was hard to defend. Montgomery County was literally busing black children into Washington, D.C. to swim in integrated public pools, while white children swam for free at Glen Echo's Crystal Pool on land the park didn't even fully own outright. Then on June 30th, 1960, the pressure stopped being symbolic. A group of Howard University students, organized under the Nonviolent Action Group, walked into Glen Echo Park. Staff shut down the lunch counter and the ice cream machine the moment they saw an interracial group approaching. So the students did something else instead. 13 of them bought tickets and climbed onto the Denzel carousel. Security confronted them. After roughly 2.5 hours, 5 students were arrested for trespassing. William Griffin, Cecil Washington Jr., Marvus Saunders, Michael Proctor, and Gwendolyn Green. It should have ended there. It didn't. Picketing continued outside the park every single day that summer. Signs read things like, "Bigotry is no fun." At one point, George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party showed up to counter-protest, and the standoff briefly turned violent. What had started as a local dispute over a carousel was now a story with regional, then national attention, and Glen Echo's owners were suddenly the face of it. Bannockburn's own residents joined the picket line day after day, standing alongside the students through the summer heat. By September, it looked like the pressure was actually working. Montgomery County's council voted to stop busing white children to the Crystal Pool until the park integrated. That sounded like leverage. It wasn't quite enough on its own. The real turning point came from somewhere nobody expected, Washington itself. A Bannockburn resident with a direct line to the federal government appealed to Attorney General Robert Kennedy, pointing out that Glen Echo leased a small piece of its land from the federal government for trolley access. In February 1961, Kennedy threatened to pull that lease. Facing the loss of the ground its own trolley line ran on, the owners folded. In March 1961, Glen Echo Park announced it would desegregate. By the end of the month, it reopened to visitors of every race. That sounds like the end of the story. It wasn't. The 5 students arrested back in June 1960 still had a criminal case hanging over them, and it climbed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Griffin versus Maryland wasn't decided until June 1964, nearly 4 years after the sit-in, and 3 years after the park had already integrated. The court sided with the students, ruling that a security guard enforcing a private park's segregation policy counted as unconstitutional state action. It was a legal win. But for 4 straight years, Glen Echo's name stayed attached to a courtroom fight it had already lost the moment it started, long after the headlines had moved on to the next thing. And while all of that was happening in public, the other fracture, the quiet one, kept widening in the background. In January 1960, months before the sit-in even happened, the D.C. to Glen Echo trolley line shut down for good. The entire reason the modern amusement park existed in 1911, selling streetcar rides, had simply stopped being relevant. Families now needed a car to get there. And now they had options they hadn't had before. Newer regional attractions, easier weekend trips, more competition pulling at the same audience Glen Echo used to have almost entirely to itself. For a few years, the park tried to paper over it. New paint, a couple of minor ride upgrades, advertising that leaned hard on nostalgia, on the idea that Glen Echo was still exactly what it had always been. For a while, none of it showed. The park kept opening every spring through the mid-1960s, more or less like nothing had changed. Rides ran, crowds came. On paper, it looked like business as usual. It wasn't. The breaking point arrived on Easter Monday, 1966, traditionally one of the park's biggest days of the year. More than 10,000 people showed up. It was too many. Ride malfunctions forced shutdowns across the Midway. Buses couldn't handle the number of people trying to leave at once. Thousands of visitors were stranded with no way home. And as tempers rose, reports of vandalism started coming in from the long walk back into the city. Local papers covered it as exactly what it looked like. An amusement park that couldn't control its own crowd. It's a strange thing to say about a place that had just survived 8 years of protests and a Supreme Court case, but a single bad afternoon did more lasting damage to Glen Echo's reputation than any of that. That's the kind of irony this story keeps returning to. The loud crisis gets remembered less than the quiet one. By 1968, the final season came and went quietly. No big farewell, no announcement that this was the end. Just a park that opened for the summer and then didn't reopen the following spring. Behind the scenes, the owners were already considering something else entirely for the land. Apartments. City planners and federal officials worried an apartment complex on that stretch of the Potomac would be a disaster for the river's edge, and they said so publicly. That opposition was enough to kill the housing plan, but it left the owners with a park nobody wanted to run and no clear buyer in sight. Instead of housing, negotiations quietly began to hand the property over to the federal government. Then, in April 1969, it became official. The owners announced Glen Echo Park would not reopen. Over the following months, the rides that had defined the place for nearly 50 years were sold off, piece by piece, to whoever was buying. The Denzel Carousel, the same one those 5 Howard University students had climbed onto 9 years earlier, nearly left Glen Echo entirely, headed for a private buyer somewhere else. It was saved almost by accident. A local councilwoman raised roughly $80,000 in about a month to buy it back and keep it on the property it had called home since 1921. Everything else wasn't so lucky. What followed wasn't a quick transformation. It was years of nothing. The Crystal Pool, built for 3,000 swimmers, the same pool at the center of the entire civil rights fight, was drained in 1968 and never filled again. Its locker rooms were condemned and just left standing, empty, doors shut. The Coaster Dips, the ride that used to give riders that 2-second view of the Potomac at the top of the climb, was torn down and burned in 1969. Everything else that could be sold was hauled off in pieces to amusement parks and private buyers scattered across the country. A place that used to pull in 30,000 people on a good weekend now sat completely silent behind a fence. Photos from those years tell the story better than any headline could. Cracked pavement where the midway used to be, rusted fences around empty lots, faded ride signs nobody bothered to take down. A place that used to be loud on weekends, all summer, every summer, was just quiet. In 1970, the federal government finally took title to the land, and the National Park Service took over administration soon after. The park reopened to the public in June 1971, but not as an amusement park, as something else entirely. An arts center, pottery studios, puppet theater, dance classes in a ballroom that used to host Tommy Dorsey. That should sound like a rescue. It wasn't, not right away. Ownership had changed, but most of the actual buildings hadn't. Visitors in the 1970s could walk past a pottery class and a few dozen feet away see a rusted, empty ride foundation still sitting there, slowly disappearing under weeds. The new identity and the old decay existed side by side for years. For more than a decade under the Park Service, the original Art Deco structures kept deteriorating, largely untouched, while the site slowly built its second identity around them. The Crystal Pool, drained since 1968, wasn't even fully demolished until 1982, 14 years after the last swimmer climbed out of it. What's left of it today is just the entrance facade, standing over an empty, filled-in basin. A doorway to a pool that hasn't held water since Lyndon Johnson was president. It took until the 2000s for the rest of the site to catch up. Between 2003 and 2010, federal, state, and county governments split the cost of a full restoration, roughly $18.9 million altogether, spread across years and multiple buildings. The Spanish Ballroom alone needed more than $4 million of that just to bring its maple dance floor and Spanish Mission roofline back from decades of neglect. The Denzel Carousel, the one a local councilwoman had scraped together $80,000 to save back in 1970, finally got its own full restoration completed around the same time. And today, it's still spinning. The carousel runs every year from May through September. The same band organs still playing, the same hand-carved animals still turning in a circle for anyone with a couple of dollars. The Spanish Ballroom still fills up most weekends, not with big bands anymore, but with swing dancers, contra dancers, people who never lived through Glen Echo's original heyday, but showed up anyway. Resident groups like Adventure Theater, the Puppet Cone, and Glen Echo Pottery now run out of buildings that used to house games and concessions. None of it looks like the park people in the 1940s would recognize as the amusement park. But almost all of it survived because of that park, because somebody decided the buildings themselves were worth keeping, even after the reason they were built for was gone. In July 2023, a severe storm tore through the park, damaging the carousel, the ballroom, and the historic organ inside it. The community's response was immediate. A fundraiser that was supposed to hit $50,000 ended up pulling in more than $113,000. By March 2025, 5 carousel animals damaged in that storm, 4 horses and a giraffe, were fully restored and back in their places, turning again like nothing had happened. These days, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people visit Glen Echo Park every year, more than it ever drew as an amusement park, just for completely different reasons. Here's the part almost nobody thinks about while they're standing in line for a $2 carousel ride. This is the exact ride 5 black teenagers were arrested for sitting on in 1960. The one that turned into a national civil rights case, that dragged through the Supreme Court for 4 years, that a park was willing to lose its federal lease over rather than give up. Today, nobody checks who's allowed to ride it. It just turns for anyone standing in line. And a few hundred feet away, past the trees, the old crystal pool is still there too, or what's left of it. The Art Deco archway still stands, exactly where Chopin built it in 1931. But there's no water underneath it anymore. Just bare concrete, weeds pushing up through the cracks, and a doorway that used to lead 3,000 people into a pool that hasn't held a single swimmer in more than 50 years. The carousel kept spinning. The pool never came back.